everyone, and welcome back to Myths Matter with James Portnow. This week we're going to be talking about Japanese mythology, which is fascinating because in Japanese mythology, something almost unique in the world happens. Japan is so interesting to me because it's one of the very few cases where an external religion came to the country, in this case Buddhism, and didn't totally replace or destroy the traditional religion, Shinto, right? And so you have these two mythological structures, the Buddhist structure and the Shinto structure, sort of existing side by side. So now you've got two mythologies, but more than that, because especially the way that Shinto works, you have a lot of people who were able to believe both in Buddhism and Shinto, and so you get a lot of these attempts to sort of reconcile the two, to bring the two together. And so not only do you have two separate myth structures, but you've also got this very interesting intersection of the two myth structures, which is different than you see almost anywhere else. For example, take Beowulf, right? Beowulf is a story as we've received it today that is the sort of attempt at Christianizing a previous story. It was monks taking an existing story and trying to make it more Christian, to make it fit their now dominant belief structure, which is different than what we see in Japan, where there's really an attempt to reconcile these two sort of disparate belief structures, not to erase or overlap one, but instead to make them harmonious, which is really interesting to me. But beyond that, I'll confess, I really love Japanese horror and all the creepy stories and bizarre and interesting monsters that come out of what I thought was Japanese mythology. But it's my own lack of knowledge. I didn't realize that that's maybe not actually Japanese mythology. So when I started researching this, I was planning to tell some creepy stories, and I didn't, because as I researched them, almost all of these things we think of today as Japanese horror and the basis of Japanese horror comes out of 15th, 16th, 17th century no dramas. And so they're written specifically to be performed on the stage. We know who created these things. No pun intended, again. So anyway, this brought up to me this question of, okay, if we understand who created a myth, if we know that a human being invented a myth whole hog, is it no longer a myth, right? Because does it no longer carry that weight of being something fundamental and maybe even something spiritual that has an origin that's beyond just the creation of a single person? And the more I wrestled with this, the more I couldn't decide, because at first I was like, okay, so take Homer, right? Well, we don't really know who Homer is, and it probably wasn't even just one person, and the stories that we have from Homer are actually probably much later compilations of a series of stories attributed to Homer. So sure, those count as myths. But then I started thinking about Virgil and the Aeneid, right? And the Aeneid is usually taken as part of Roman myth structure. But we know who Virgil was. We absolutely know who this guy was. We know that he was a single individual. We know that he was inventing this sort of himself, and we know who he was writing it for and why he was writing these things. So at what point do we consider something a myth? And not in that myth versus folklore sense that we've already talked about, where we're talking about myth as sort of having to do with the history of the gods and folklore being, well, everything else. This is more fundamental. At what point does a myth become a myth in our culture? If 200 years from now, people are retelling the Tolkien stories, right, and retelling Lord of the Rings, and are using it as analogies and metaphors and ways to teach moral lessons, does that become part of our mythology, right? If it becomes fundamental to our culture, does that now become a myth? And that's something that I don't really have a good answer to. I don't know yet. I have to think about it more. And so at some point in the future, I may play around with telling some of the later Japanese ghost stories and horror stories, just so we can talk about this subject more, because I need to think about it, and I would love to hear from all of you. If any of you have thoughts on at what point something becomes a myth, feel free to tell me. Let me know in the comments, because I'm still trying to process. I don't know what the cutoff line is for putting a myth on this series. So, we're building it as we go. But I think that's about it for me. Join me next time for Australian Aboriginal mythology, which is really interesting because it's sort of one of the oldest myth cycles we have. It's the oldest continuing religion that exists anywhere in the world. And so, yeah, come with me next time into the Dreamtime. And I will see you all there. Take care, everybody.